In a packed courtroom in the US, over 62 million people were glued to their screens, watching what was supposed to be a straightforward hearing. But no one expected what happened next. President Ibrahim Traoré, the rising global voice from Burkina Faso, stood in the courtroom, calm and composed. But then mid-sentence he was cut off by Justice Clarence Thomas. In a shocking move, Traoré was stripped of his diplomatic rights and banned from international affairs. Right there, on live TV. No debate, no fair process. It seemed like the story had ended before it began, until Ibrahim quietly reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope no one had seen before. What was inside? Why did it leave the most powerful judge in America completely speechless? Let's take you back a few hours earlier. Atlanta hadn't just woken up that morning, it braced for a storm. The skies were heavy, streets frozen over. Outside the federal courthouse, the scene looked more like a military operation than a legal proceeding. Barricades, armored trucks, drones, and dozens of reporters packed behind lines, waiting. What was supposed to be a quiet case about a little-known education fund, called Hope Forward, suddenly exploded into global headlines. The accused, Ibrahim Traoré, Africa's most talked-about leader. The moment it leaked that Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas would personally oversee the case, the legal world went silent. He hadn't touched a lower court case in years. His presence alone meant this wasn't business as usual. Someone powerful wanted Traoré taken down, and they didn't waste time making it clear. He wasn't brought in as a witness, not even as a diplomat. Federal marshals flanked him like a criminal. No legal team allowed by his side. Just him, standing alone under a high ceiling that felt more like judgment than justice. Justice Thomas sat at the bench, robe crisp, voice cold. This court exists to defend the moral standards of the United States judiciary, he said, striking the gavel with force. But it wasn't about truth. It was about control. Every time Ibrahim tried to speak, to explain, to simply be heard, he was shut down. Mr. Justice, if I may clarify enough, Thomas snapped. Hope Forward is governed by an international treaty. This is not the time for geopolitical speeches. Not a single dollar in 2023 was you are not recognized to speak at this time. To the millions watching, it was clear. This wasn't justice. It was theater. Thomas wasn't just the judge. He was the star of a scripted takedown. Evidence was ignored. Legal filings tossed aside. His voice treated like an enemy. And all of it played out live, frame by frame. A proud African leader silenced in the very courtroom that claimed to uphold democracy. The American flag behind him didn't wave. It stood still, held back not by wind, but by hypocrisy. Even the Constitution etched on the wall seemed to shrink away. Then came the ruling. Mr. Traoré is hereby stripped of all diplomatic status and barred from any international role for the next 10 years. No jury, no vote, just a single man's decision. The room gasped. Then, silence. Ibrahim didn't flinch. He didn't bow his head. He just stood there, like a man watching his house burn down. A house he lived in, but didn't build. What started as a financial hearing had turned into something much darker. A public dismantling, broadcast to the world. But here's the thing. Ibrahim had seen injustice before. He knew what it looked like, and this time, he was ready. Raw, unfiltered, no mask, no illusion. Behind Ibrahim's calm expression, his mind quietly slipped back 22 years, to Wagadugu. It was night. The sky heavy and dark. Soldiers dragged him across the dirt, kicking and beating him for one reason only. He dared to speak out when a French company poisoned his people's land. There was no trial, no lawyer, just fists, fear, and silence. They locked him in a filthy, cramped cell. All he had was a small piece of hope, a copy of his country's constitution, smuggled inside the lining of a soldier's boot. Night after night, he read it under the faint moonlight. Over time, the words stopped being loved, became a promise. They tried to break him, but in the silence, something stronger began to grow. Later, he joined the army not for love of battle, but because violence kept finding his people. He didn't fight for gold or power. He fought to protect burned farms, vanished villages, and voices buried too soon. One day, they ordered him to open fire on peaceful protesters. He refused. That moment changed everything. The people rose up. They chanted his name not because he was flawless, but because he was real. One of them, he didn't take power. The people handed it to him with calloused hands and quiet trust. When foreign leaders offered him money to play along, he turned it down. Instead, he built a national fund not from elites, but from farmers, teachers, laborers, because to him, real power should come from the people. And now, in that cold Atlanta courtroom, standing thousands of miles from home, Ibrahim wasn't just a man. He was living memory, a symbol of a long fight for land, for dignity, for voice. So, when Clarence Thomas silenced him, it didn't surprise him. It wasn't new. Just another page in a story he'd seen before. He didn't shout, he didn't argue. He simply stood still, because sometimes, silence says what words cannot. Some, in that courtroom, didn't get it, but millions watching did. They didn't see defeat. They saw defiance. They saw a man who carried the weight of those who never got a seat at the table. Just by standing, he showed what strength really looks like. And just when the court tried to bury history, history spoke. The judge called for a 10-minute recess. Security swept the aisles. Clarence Thomas disappeared into his private chamber, calm, as if the story was over. But it wasn't. As Ibrahim stepped away from the podium, a man in a charcoal suit passed him. Too quick to notice, too smooth to question. In one seamless motion, he slipped a golden envelope into Ibrahim's coat pocket. No words, no eye contact, just one quiet act so precise. It felt rehearsed by fate. Only one camera caught a glimpse of flicker in the background, barely noticeable. But Ibrahim felt it instantly. The weight in his coat shifted. So did the weight of everything that followed. In a side room, away from the cameras and the polished marble, Ibrahim opened the envelope with steady hands. Thick paper, sealed with red wax. The initials CT in the corner, not his. Inside photos. Clarence Thomas lounging on the deck of an Italian super yacht. A receipt for a $42,000 luxury watch. Bank transfers millions sent from a billionaire hedge fund to a private school account for a relative. Behind it all, a typed report listing 7 Supreme Court rulings, each favoring the same billionaires funding Thomas's lifestyle. The last page said just one thing, written in red ink: all 7 rulings, signed or authored by Clarence Thomas. Outside, the world thought the court was on break, that the drama had paused. But in that moment, the real story had just begun. Ibrahim knew what he was holding. It wasn't just paper. It was fire. The kind that could flip the narrative, trigger a national reckoning, and possibly shake the entire system now trying to destroy him. But he also knew the risk. If he moved too fast, too loud, it could be spun against him, framed as desperation, interference, even revenge. This envelope could save his legacy, or torch it. Now, standing in the quiet between silence and confrontation, Ibrahim faced a choice no judge could make for him. The next move was his. Stay quiet and survive, or speak up and risk everything. The moment called for silence. But Ibrahim knew silence now would be surrender. So he chose fire. When the court reconvened, something had shifted. It wasn't visible, but it was there, in the air, in the stairs, in the way the room suddenly felt smaller. Even the walls seemed to know something had changed. Just as Clarence Thomas walked back in, his face unreadable, gavel in hand, but his eyes darted around the room with just a hint of unease. Then Ibrahim stood. Calm, steady. Your Honor, he said, raising his hand. I request permission to speak for the sake of my name, and for the dignity of this process. Thomas immediately shook his head. This court has heard enough. But outside the courtroom, the internet had already erupted. Rumors about a golden envelope were flooding social media. Journalists were whispering into live cameras. The pressure was growing. And Thomas, feeling it from every direction, gave in. 2 minutes, he snapped. That's all Ibrahim needed. He reached into his coat and unfolded the documents. No grand gestures, no anger, just steady hands revealing one cold, undeniable truth after another. Behind him, on the courtroom monitors, the first image appeared. Clarence Thomas stepping onto a yacht in the Cayman Islands. A second photo, Thomas drinking from a gold-rimmed glass, beside billionaire donor Harlan Crow. Then the ledgers, watches, resort stays, school tuition payments, none of it declared. Then, the final page, 7 rulings. All written or co-signed by Justice Thomas. Every single one had benefited the very people funding his lavish lifestyle. The courtroom froze. Even the bailiff looked away. And then came Ibrahim's voice, clear and sharp. If I'm on trial for transparency, then who judges the man hiding behind the robe? It wasn't a question. It was an earthquake. Reporters jumped to their feet. Senators in the gallery exchanged stunned glances. The public watching live around the world leaned in. Thomas sat still, his hands clenched, his lips drawn tight. His gavel stayed down. Because, for the first time in decades, power had no defense. Ibrahim didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood there, quietly, as the entire room began to turn. The courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It had become a mirror. And in that reflection, justice didn't look blind. She looked bought. But Ibrahim wasn't done. Because once truth is freed, it demands to be heard all the way. He stepped forward again. "Let the timeline speak," he said softly, motioning toward the screen. A new slide appeared. A private jet invoice, dated one day before Thomas ruled in favor of a logistics giant linked to his benefactor. Next, hotel records for luxury suites, paid by a known political insider. Slide after slide revealed the pattern. The same names, the same timing, the same rewards. This wasn't coincidence. It was currency. Power traded for silence. Justice sold for luxury. And then, the final blow. "I would like to call a witness," Ibrahim said. Gasps filled the room. From the back, a woman stood, pale, but steady. Julia Mendes, a former court transcriptionist. She walked to the front and faced the judge. "I was ordered to remove any references to gifts," she said. "Not by procedure, by pressure." The room went silent. She named files she'd been told to delete, conversations she recorded, emails. Back to clerks working under Thomas. The courtroom stopped listening. It began unraveling. Camera crews zoomed in, reporters typed with frenzy. And Thomas, once immovable behind the bench, now gripped the arms of his chair, like a man bracing for collapse. His face flushed, his hands trembled, his gaze fell, and for the first time, the weight of judgment shifted. The man who once ruled the room now looked like he might break under the weight of his own record. The marble walls around them had been built to echo justice, but on this day, they echoed something else: reckoning. The echo of certainty, now whispered with doubt. Then, cutting through the tension from the back of the courtroom, came a voice unfamiliar, calm, sharp as glass. "Who judges the man who sits above all judgment?" No one answered. No one could. And as that question echoed again, and again through the chamber, the walls of power seemed to shudder. For a full heartbeat, the room didn't breathe. No gavel, no movement. Just silence dense, like the air before a storm. And in that breathless space, something shifted. Not theatrics. Not outrage. Accountability. A man rose from the government's table. Dark blue suit. Straight spine. It was Assistant Attorney General Mark Delaney. He didn't ask to speak. He didn't wait to be recognized. He stepped forward and said the words no one expected, but everyone somehow knew were coming. "In light of the evidence presented, this proceeding is hereby suspended. The Department of Justice will launch an immediate ethics investigation into Justice Clarence Thomas." The gallery didn't erupt. It inhaled. One collective global gasp. The Chiron. On every news screen, updated in real time. Thomas, under federal eye on VSTIJTO, and cameras zoomed in. Reporters scrambled, but in the center of it all, Ibrahim stood perfectly still, not forced into silence, but owning it. Then came the reversal no one dared predict. A court clerk stepped up, her voice measured and precise. "All charges against Mr. Traoré are dismissed. There is no legal basis for sanction." No one clapped. No cheers. The moment was too heavy for celebration. Justice Clarence Thomas didn't speak. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. His hands, once clenched, now hung limp. His eyes moved from the press to Ibrahim, and finally down to the floor. And then he stood. No words. No nods. No authority left to wield. He turned and walked down. From the bench, each step was caught by cameras in crisp, almost cinematic detail. His robe dragged behind him, not as a symbol of honor, but a shadow too heavy to lift. No one stood, not out of respect but reckoning. A symbol of untouchable power had just been disarmed. Not by riots, not by force, by truth. Outside, the world watched in stunned silence. Headlines spread like wildfire. Justice falls, Traoré vindicated. Power confronted. But inside that chamber, the only sound was the soft echo of leather shoes on marble, growing fainter with each step. Justice hadn't roared. It had whispered, and that whisper had brought a giant to his knees. As Clarence Thomas vanished behind the curtains of his own silence, all eyes turned to the man they tried to silence. Would he rise in vengeance or in vision? Ibrahim Traoré didn't move right away. He let the silence breathe, let the moment settle like dust after a collapse. The judge was gone. The gavel, meaningless, but the power in the room, it hadn't left. It now lived in the rolling cameras, the watching millions. and the lawmakers frozen in their marble rows. Everyone expected him to lash out, to reclaim his name, demand justice, maybe call for blood. But Ibrahim turned not to the judge's bench, but to the gallery, to the heart of the system that tried to bury him. His voice didn't rise in rage. It rose in clarity. "I don't want his seat," he said, each word cut clean. "I want to make sure no one can ever buy it again." The words landed like a tremor, not loud, but deep. Heads turned. Lawmakers leaned in not because they didn't hear, but because they felt something new. Accountability forged in grace. Ibrahim didn't pace. He didn't shout. He simply raised 3 fingers calm. Fernand laid out a vision no jury could deliver, but a nation could. First, he said, all federal judges must publicly disclose gifts, travel, and financial quarter. He didn't need to accuse anyone. The truth was already sitting in the air like a written verdict. A few seats over, a congressional aide lifted their head, whispered something to a colleague, and began typing. Second, Ibrahim continued, whistleblowers in the judicial system must receive full protection and the right to testify before Congress without fear. As he said it, he looked directly at the press gallery. Not to provoke, but to remind. He was speaking not just to the room, but to the country. To a nation that had seen too many secrets buried under robes and titles. Some reporters leaned forward. Instinctively, they knew this wasn't the end of a hearing. It was the start of something else. They weren't just covering a story anymore. They were witnessing a turning point. Then came the final reform. Not shouted, not forced, but spoken with quiet conviction. And third, Ibrahim said, we must establish an independent judicial ethics commission, one that answers to no president, no court, no branch of government. The words didn't rise. They fell like a stone into still water. And the ripples, immediate, permanent. A woman in the front row slowly closed her notebook and put down her pen. She didn't need to write anymore. In that moment, Ibrahim wasn't proposing policy. He was holding up a mirror to the entire justice system and daring it to look itself in the eye. No applause followed. Not yet, because the silence wasn't empty. It was alive, charged with something undeniable. Even the marble columns felt like they were leaning in. No judge objected. No senator moved. No clerk dared interrupt. Some truths are too sharp to debate. Some moments are too precise to touch. Ibrahim had walked into that courtroom as the accused, and now, without a badge, without a title, without even a legal team behind him, he stood as the author of something larger than vindication, reform, born from injustice. His final words didn't echo. They settled. Like iron cooling into shape. The room didn't erupt. It radiated energy pressed into phones, across headlines, into the bones of institutions watching from afar. Something ancient had cracked. And the world knew it. By nightfall, the live stream had crossed 60 million views. That number had once been reserved for war, disaster, crisis. But this wasn't destruction. This was disclosure. News anchors cut off mid-sentence. Commentators stopped speculating and started reporting. The language changed fast. No longer a scandal. Now a reckoning. No longer an allegation. A collapse of the system's integrity. And at the center of it all stood a man not born of this system. But now, defining the moment it had to answer for itself, Ibrahimtraoré had entered that courtroom as a man under judgment. But the ground beneath the court's feet had shifted. By 9:03 p.m., confirmation broke from the Capitol. Congress had called an emergency bipartisan session. This wasn't symbolic. It was surgical. The decision, unanimous. 12 federal judges across multiple jurisdictions would now face immediate financial audits. Not private, not redacted, not delayed. Every flight, every favor, every dollar in the dark public archived, exposed. And then came the final strike. Justice Clarence Thomas was formally suspended from the bench. Not praised, not defended, not quietly retired. Suspended. The letter, signed by the House Judiciary Oversight Committee, was delivered by hand. No cameras, no podium. Just 3 sentences that ended decades of silence. The world didn't respond with chaos. It responded with clarity. In law schools across the country, students printed out transcripts of the hearing and taped them to their classroom walls. Lectures turned into forums. Professors who once warned students not to name names were now asking them to study how one name, spoken calmly, had shaken a system to its core. In homes across the Midwest, in subway cars, on bar stools and back porches, people didn't just watch Ibrahim's testimony once. They watched it again. And again, it wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. No fury. No theatrics. Just a man who refused to lie. And refused to kneel. A man who stood still long enough for the truth to rise behind him like a wave. For years, the American judiciary had protected itself with tradition, with ritual, with robes stitched in silence. The belief that those who sat above justice were also beyond it. But now, under the weight of one man's refusal to look away, that illusion cracked. What began as a hearing to bury him had become a mirror. And what that mirror showed wasn't just corruption, it showed complicity. And maybe that was the most devastating truth of all. Because Ibrahim Traoré hadn't just survived their system, he had forced it to see itself. And in the end, it blinked first, as the institutions trembled under their own reflection. The world turned to Ibrahim not to watch him break the system, but to see how he might reshape it. He didn't walk out of that courthouse like a man who had won. There was no fist in the air, no podium waiting. The sky had turned amber with the last light of day, stretching long shadows across the stone steps. He stepped onto the courthouse steps, where cameras were primed like vultures, ready to feast on a spectacle. But there was no grand scene, no outburst, no roar of victory, just quiet resolve. Camera flashes flickered like stuttering heartbeats. Dozens of microphones stretched toward him. Reporters called his name in 4 languages. They were hungry for drama. Ibrahim gave them none. He stood still, silent until one voice broke through the noise. "Do you feel like you've won?" It came from a CNN correspondent. Her tone was calm but searching. Ibrahim turned, just slightly, met her eyes, and said, "I didn't come here to win. I came to end the shameful things that were allowed to grow in the dark." Then he turned again, not toward the crowd, but away from it. His shoulders upright, his pace steady, his silence absolute. The camera crews didn't chase him. They just stood there, stunned lenses pointed not at a politician or a protester, but at a man who had delivered the truth, and walked away without taking a single bow. And the message, it didn't fade. It deepened. In the days that followed, while the media dissected Clarence Thomas's finances, and late-night comedians made a circus out of scandal, Ibrahim said nothing. No talk shows, no interviews, no headlines, just work. He sat down, day after day, drafting in silence, word by word, clause by clause. Exactly 1 week after the hearing that shook the country, a document was hand-delivered to the Congressional Ethics Committee. 47 pages, 3 pillars, 0 loopholes. It was titled, The Judicial Transparency Act of 2025. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a vendetta. It was a blueprint, clear, surgical, unflinching, every section backed by precedent. Every reform made real with implementation steps. It didn't shame the judiciary. It demanded it grow up. Then something unthinkable happened. Lawmakers from both parties signed on. Names that had spent years at war in the House chamber now stood side by side in ink, under Ibrahim's draft. This wasn't political theater. It was awakening. No shouting, no spin. Just evidence, and a man who never weaponized it. He had walked in, painted as the accused, but emerged as the one who rewrote the rules for those who believed they were untouchable. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with a truth so pure. It didn't just break the silence, it built what came next. And as the ink dried on that bill born from silence and dignity, the world slowly moved on. Except for Ibrahim Traoré, he didn't stay for the spotlight. He returned to the land that had once nearly buried him. The red dust of Burkina Faso stirred under a faded pickup truck, rolling quietly into the capital. There were no parades, no cameras, no red carpet. Just Ibrahim. Same coat, same stride. But something was different. He wasn't returning from exile. He was coming back from war. A war fought without bullets, but one that left tremors just the same. The eyes that greeted him didn't ask if he'd survived. They measured the cost of his courage. At the village square, turned temporary town hall, rows of plastic chairs sat crooked on cracked concrete. A brittle mic hummed with static. But when Ibrahim stepped up the steps, he didn't bring guards. He brought truth. The building was small, its walls chipped, the paint peeled. But the silence inside could match any courtroom in the West. Farmers, teachers, widows, and restless youth crowded shoulder to shoulder, their breath rising with the heat. Elders sat at the front, silent, still, watching. Ibrahim stood, but he didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. They had seen everything, not just on screens, but in whispers around lanterns, in kitchens, in fields. They knew. And then, a woman stood, Her hair was gray, her clothes plain, but her presence regal. She spoke from the third row. Her voice cracked with age but not with doubt. You didn't bring down a man, son. She looked straight at him. You pulled down an entire systems. It could remember it was built to serve people, to serve people. The room exhaled. It wasn't applause, it was understanding. Ibrahim met her eyes come steady, the same presence that had once silenced a courtroom oceans away. No victory speech, no grand declarations, just a quiet nod. That single moment spoke, in a voice aged by time but sharpened by truth, became the closing line to a global chapter. By nightfall, her words were printed on front pages in 3 continents. But the story didn't end there. In the weeks that followed, classrooms from Cape Town to Copenhagen began printing Ibrahim's words on lecture slides, etched beside landmark rulings and historic dissents. When one man dares to speak truth in the heart of a courtroom, power itself begins to tremble. First chalked on a blackboard in a law school in Dar es Salaam, it would echo all the way to Harvard, to Oxford, even to The Hague. But Ibrahim didn't return to a hero's life. He returned to the work. In a small, plain room behind the town hall, no cameras, no titles, he sat with young local officials. No air conditioning. A cracked whiteboard. His pen ran dry more than once. Still, there was more leadership in that room than in most marble chambers built for show. He didn't give speeches. He asked questions. He listened more than he talked. He passed the mic first to the women. He never once mentioned Clarence Thomas. Never said the word scandal, because for him, it had never been about a man. It had always been about the structure. And now, his mission wasn't punishment. It was prevention. Outside, dusk settled across the land, the same land that had once been stolen, poisoned, forgotten. But tonight, it stood a little taller. Because the man who had defended it not with weapons, but with truth had come home. Not as a hero, not as a savior, but as a servant. A leader, shaped by fire, but not burned by it. And the final image. Not a stage. Not a podium. Just Ibrahim, walking alone through the back courtyard. A notebook tucked beneath his arm. The sounds of village life behind him, children laughing, goats braying, fires crackling. No medals, no entourage. Only truth carried with quiet strength. This wasn't the end. It was a reminder. He didn't come to conquer. He came to show the world what justice really looks like, when spoken by someone with nothing left to prove. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If this story moved you, let it move others. Like, share, subscribe, and in the comments, tell us what moment stayed with you the most. Because in the end, stories like this don't belong to any one person. They belong to all of us. And together, our voices are stronger than silence. Asked ChatGPT.